is my pleasure and privilege to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Catriona McKinnon from the University of Reading. Professor McKinnon is Professor of Political Theory in the School for Politics and International Relations at the University of Reading in the UK. She showed some loyalty to her educational institution by receiving her bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degrees from the University of London. And she taught at the University of Exeter and then the University of York before taking up her current position at Reading. In addition to numerous articles and reviews, she has written 2 books with a third on the way.
That's right, yeah.
But it's the subject of her second book, Toleration, that she's going to talk to us about today. And in particular, she's going to help us grapple with this question: are toleration and neutrality incompatible ideals? So please join me in welcoming Professor McKinnon.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you for coming out at the beginning of your weekend. I do appreciate the effort you've made to do that. And I'd also like to thank the Institute for the invitation to come and talk on this topic. 2 of the ideals I'm going to be discussing this evening are toleration and neutrality. And from my research into the Institute and my experience of it since I've been here, which has only been a couple of days, I really think this is the perfect topic for this place. As a liberal arts institution, NYU Abu Dhabi provides, I think, a real haven for philosophically informed and theoretical thinking about the underpinnings for and the political aspects of the ideals of toleration and neutrality. And in addition, I think the student body at the Institute, global and cosmopolitan as it is, provide a very good audience for a talk on this topic, and I know some of them are here this evening as well. So all in all, I'm extremely pleased to be here and grateful to all of you for coming out to hear me talk on this topic. So, as Matty mentioned, in 2006, I published a book on the topic of toleration called Toleration: A Critical Introduction. And in that book, I defended a liberal approach to toleration, which I articulated in terms of individual rights. And I then applied that liberal conception of toleration to some real-world, concrete problems of toleration. And having written and published the book, I thought that I then knew what I thought about toleration and moved on to work on something completely different, climate change, which is what I've been doing since. However, at the end of last year, I had a kind of hiatus in my work on climate change, and I thought I would go back to the literature on toleration in some of the journals and just see what had been happening in my absence, so to speak, see what developments there had been in that literature since I had been following it closely in the process of writing my second book. And I was quite surprised and dismayed by what I found there. It seemed to me that some key figures on the contemporary philosophical scene, some key theorists of toleration, who differed in quite a number of ways and were nevertheless converging on a view of toleration as a redundant political principle and practice in ideal circumstances, on the grounds that toleration as such a political principle and practice for ideal circumstances had been supplanted by the much younger and less familiar liberal ideal of neutrality. So a number of people seem to be that this kind of view of the place of toleration in our political in the liberal ideal polity, seemed to be becoming part of the zeitgeist, part of the sort of received wisdom about the place for toleration in thinking about political ideals. And I think this is quite wrong, and I think it's a worrying development in the philosophy of toleration. And I want to try this evening to reject or provide reasons for thinking that we should resist that development. So in order to do that, I want to do 4 things this evening. First of all, I want to articulate the liberal ideal according to which I'm going to argue toleration is not redundant. And I'm going to do this in some detail because the details matter, and it's important to get them right to understand why this movement in the current literature is really misplaced. So you'll need to bear with me while I work through some of the details in describing that political liberal ideal. Having done that, I then want to show what the objection is. So I want to explain why it is that some of these prominent thinkers about toleration are converging on the view that toleration is redundant and has been replaced by neutrality as a political ideal. I then want to reject that move, and I want to try and convince you that you shouldn't accept it either. And along the way, I'm going to be commenting on the nature and the purpose of political ideals. So what are political ideals? What do we want from our political ideals? What's the point of thinking in terms of political ideals? Perhaps we should abandon them altogether. I don't think we should, but that's a kind of sub-theme of what I'm going to be talking about this evening. So let me begin by laying out for you the liberal ideal in which I'm going to argue toleration has an absolutely fundamental role to play. And I'm going to do this by describing an imaginary place called Liberalia. And in Liberalia, citizens, let's call them liberal citizens, are political equals, and they view themselves as such. Their public debate and their legislative decisions are constrained by a constitution, and that constitution is derived from a higher level abstract set of principles of justice, which state that basic rights, liberties, and opportunities are to be distributed equally across all citizens. This higher level set of principles of justice also state a commitment to economic or distributive justice for people in Liberalia, but I'm not going to mention anything about that this evening. It's not really relevant to the arguments I want to make. So this vision of justice, this higher level set of principles of justice, people in Liberalia call justice as fairness. And it's that which informs their constitution and from which all political life, according to which all political and social cooperation is then constrained. So in Liberalia, all citizens have the same rights to freedom of conscience and expression. They have the same rights to freedom of movement and association, and to political engagement and activism, if that's what they are interested in. They have the same opportunities to access education, the various professions, and the positions of power and status in Liberalia. And as I've said, liberal citizens call these principles, which lay out these commitments, justice as fairness. And importantly, and this will be important for the argument to come, the majority of people in Liberalia go beyond a mere passive acceptance of these principles as constraints on their social cooperation, and instead have a real active commitment to these principles of justice as fairness. So in other words, people in Liberalia, or the majority of them, don't just accept these principles because this is the way things have always been done. They don't accept them because of fear of the consequences of not accepting them. They don't accept them out of some kind of sense of apathy. They just can't be bothered to, try and think through an alternative set of principles. That's not true of the majority of people in Liberalia. The majority in Liberalia have a kind of active, understand what their principles of justice mean, and actively commit to them from within their own hearts, so to speak. Some of them may even be proud to live in a society which is governed by these principles. However, it's not the case that Liberalia is a society of people who preach and practice the liberalism of their political lives in their personal lives. So liberal citizens need not be liberal people, and many citizens in Liberalia are not, in fact, liberal in their private and personal lives, so to speak. So in Liberalia, people have a diverse range of visions of the good life, which are accompanied by very different philosophical and metaphysical outlooks. So, for example, some people who are liberal citizens in their political lives, as private people, believe in a God, whereas some are atheists. Some have domestic lives which are ordered, for example, according to a gender division of labour, so women do one thing, men do another, and that's how it should be, whereas others don't have that view of the division of domestic labour. Some oppose homosexuality as a sin or as abhorrent, whereas others are in same-sex marriages with children. And some strive for lives of full Kantian autonomy, self-government and self-direction, whereas others are content, for example, to accept any pre-existing hierarchies that might exist in the cultural groups that they're members of. So it's an important feature of Liberalia, and it's an important feature of the liberal ideal that I'm outlining for you, that the citizens of Liberalia have vigorous disagreements on the big questions of human life, so the purpose of life, the nature of the universe and the place of human beings in it, the best ways to live, both for oneself and both with others, and also with others, what to believe and what's of value. They have big disagreements on these questions. Nevertheless, they converge on justice as fairness, their liberal set of principles, political principles. So you might be thinking, how can people who are not necessarily liberal in their private lives agree to liberal principles of justice to govern their political lives? I mean, surely there's a problem there, right? Surely there's a disconnect there between the possibility that many members of the majority who affirm this liberal vision of justice are not themselves in their personal private lives, are not liberal people. Surely then they wouldn't affirm a liberal conception of justice. Well, I don't think that's the case. I think that despite these disagreements between them, and indeed because of these disagreements between them, the citizens of Liberalia jointly affirm justice as fairness as best for them. And they do so for two reasons. So there are two features of people in this imaginary place which explain why, despite the fact that they may not be liberals in their private lives, they nevertheless are liberal citizens and they actively commit to justice as fairness. And these two features are as follows. First of all, the majority of them are committed to finding some principles of justice, some principles of social cooperation on which they can all agree, despite their differences. And they're willing to assure one another that they will each abide by these principles. So in other words, you were to think of people in this imaginary place as justice seekers. They want to find principles of social cooperation which can deliver peaceful, profitable, shared social and political life for all of them, despite their differences. Because the alternative to that is endless conflict, given the differences that divide them. So that's the first feature of people in Liberalia. I'm not going to focus on that feature of them in any great detail. More important for my argument is the second feature of people in Liberalia. So what's true of the majority of them is that most of them think that the differences between them that exist in Liberalia are the inevitable outcome of the exercise of human reason in conditions of freedom. Okay, they accept this fact about what happens when human beings exercise their reason in conditions of freedom. So, for example, most of them think that when people are free from external threat, coercion, manipulation, or oppression, then they will naturally come to form different opinions on the big questions of philosophy, value, and religion, over which people in Liberalia do, in fact, disagree. So, another way to express this is to say that the majority of liberal citizens in Liberalia accept that it can be reasonable for other people not to share their particular vision of the good life or their particular understanding of their place in the universe or their particular set of religious commitments. Although they themselves truly believe and cleave to those values and beliefs, for themselves, they accept that it may be reasonable for other people not to share the views they have, because when human reason operates freely, the inevitable outcome will be this pluralism, will be this diversity of opinions on the big questions that matter to all of us. So as a result of that, the majority of people in Liberalia view the pluralism that characterises their society as inevitable and as not to be regretted. They don't think it's a shame that not everybody shares the same religion that they do. They accept this as just a natural consequence of the free exercise of human reason. Now, most liberal citizens accept, the ones who accept this fact about how human reason operates, most of them accept that any principles of justice on which they could agree must take account of and reflect the permanence of that reasonable disagreement between them on these big questions. And it's for that reason that they affirm their view of justice as fairness, because the liberties and the opportunities at the heart of that vision of justice, so for example, freedom of conscience, freedom of thought, freedom of worship, freedom of association, freedom of expression, those freedoms, those liberties, allow everybody in Liberalia to live as they think best, given the reasonable disagreement between people, the majority of people in Liberalia, on these big questions. So that's why in Liberalia, people who aren't private liberals the majority of people who aren't private liberals are political liberals. So that's the majority in Liberalia. It's not the case, however, that all people in Liberalia have this view of the differences that exist between them, have this view of the pluralism which provides a permanent backdrop for their political life. Not all people in Liberalia accept that this is the natural outcome of human reason when it operates in conditions of freedom. So although Liberalia is an ideal society and is viewed as such by most of its citizens, as I've been emphasising, it nevertheless contains some people who aren't convinced, in the way that the majority is, that disagreement on the big questions can be reasonable. So it contains some people who think that those who don't share, for example, their religious beliefs are not reasonable people, that something's gone wrong, there's an error in their reasoning. So although the majority of liberal citizens, as I've been saying, affirm justice as fairness as their preferred set of principles from reasons that are drawn from within their own moral compass, from within their own hearts, so to speak, not all people affirm justice as fairness for these reasons. So Liberalia has, if you like, a dark side, which is related to the controversial social practice of the wearing of bowler hats. And here's a man wearing a hat. So, in Liberalia, the practice of wearing a bowler hat is exclusive to men, and it's associated with a religion that was the established one in the society that preceded Liberalia. Imagine. And in that society, it was illegal for men to be seen in public without a bowler hat. Now, many people in Liberalia continue to practice this religion, and many, although not all men, of this religion can be seen wearing bowler hats. So for many people who have this religion, it's a practice of great significance to them. Now, the laws of Liberalia remain silent on the practice because the religion with which it's associated forms part of the pluralism that is so characteristic of Liberalia. So in other words, because it can be reasonable for people to either have or not have the religious faith with which the practice is associated, the laws in Liberalia have nothing to say on whether people ought to be are legally required to wear bowler hats in public, or whether they ought not to be permitted legally to wear bowler hats in public. It just doesn't touch on that question. It leaves it up to individuals. And the reason that's the case is, as I've said, because the religion in which the practice is embedded is something over which it's reasonable for people to disagree. Okay? It's reasonable to have the faith or not have the faith. Okay, however, there are some liberal citizens who don't want the law to remain silent on the practice of bowler hat wearing. And I'm going to identify 2 such groups, and then I'm going to keep returning to these groups to illustrate the argument I want to make about the relationship between toleration and neutrality. Okay, so one group hankers for a return to this earlier state, this religious state. They think that anyone who doesn't share their religion is unreasonable, so they think it is unreasonable for other people not to share the faith they have and all the values and everything that go along with that. And they think that the Constitution and the laws of Liberalia should, as a result, reflect their religious values and make alternative religious practices impossible. And I'm going to refer to these people as the milliners. And there they are, wearing their hats. And the milliners want bowler hat wearing in public places to be legally required of all men. So that's one group that doesn't conform to the descriptions that are true of the majority of citizens because they don't believe that it's reasonable for people to not to share their religion. There's also a separate group in Liberalia who have an opposing opinion. And let's call these the secularists, and there they are with no hats. So the secularists think that the freedoms which are protected in Liberalia should not include the freedom to wear a bowler hat. They think, and many of them speak with a French accent, they think that true freedom of religion for all is secure only when public and political life is purged of all religious symbolism and practice, and as a result, they want a legal ban on bowler hat wearing in public. Okay, so we have 3 groups, and to probe the relationship between toleration and neutrality, I'm going to ask questions about how these 3 groups ought to relate to one another. We have the majority who exist in conditions of pluralism. They may not be liberal people in private, some of them are, many of them won't be, but nevertheless they affirm a liberal vision of justice. And they affirm that actively, and they affirm it from within their own moral vision, from within their own hearts, so to speak. We have 2 other separate groups, the milliners and the secularists, who are opposed to that majority with respect to the question of whether the law ought to remain silent on the religious practice of bowler hat wearing. The milliners want it to be legally required, as used to be true in this society, and the secularists want it to be banned. And the majority want the law to remain silent on the practice. So my question is, how should the majority in Liberalia treat these groups, the milliners and the secularists? And there are at least 2 ideals to which we might appeal in trying to answer this question. So on the one hand, we might appeal to neutrality, as a number of prominent contemporary philosophers of toleration have been doing. On the other hand, we might appeal to toleration. And as I said at the beginning, in some of the recent literature on liberal ideals and toleration, there's been a shift towards a characterization of liberalism just in terms of neutrality, and a consequent shift in the vision of how of the kind of principle that it's appropriate to use in deciding how to treat people like secularists and milliners. And I want to reject that shift. I want to reject that trend. So it's that move that I want to address by asking how the milliners and the secularists ought to be treated by the state in Liberalia. But let me quickly take a step back for scholarly reasons. So you might think, well, why does asking this question about Liberalia matter? Well, I think it matters in itself so that we can come to understand the nature of the liberal political ideal and the kinds of values that constitute it. However, I also think it matters for scholarly reasons. And the vision of the ideal liberal polity that I've just outlined to you represents John Rawls's later vision of liberalism as political. And John Rawls was an American political philosopher, and it's impossible to overestimate the influence he has had on analytic political philosophy. In every analytic political philosopher, even though they may not end up endorsing Rawls, and very few people do endorse everything Rawls says, all of them have at some point read Rawls and have had to make their minds up about what they think about Rawls. They have defined themselves by reference to his work at some point in their career. His major works, three major works, the vision of Liberalia that I've outlined to you is described in his 1993 book, Political Liberalism, which is importantly very different from the earlier book, A Theory of Justice, which is where the story really began with Rawls. So what I'm trying to do in picking apart Liberalia and trying to place the ideals of toleration and neutrality in that imaginary state is, from a scholarly perspective, is to clarify the role that toleration has in the political philosophy of John Rawls, and to reassert the central role that that ideal has in his political philosophy. Okay, so I have laid out and described for you what people are like in Liberalia and why they accept and affirm principles of justice as fairness as the right principles for their society. Let me now move on to clarify the two ideals which I want to situate in this place, which I want to locate in Liberalia. That is the political ideals of neutrality and of toleration. So let's start with neutrality. Neutrality is likely to be, or certainly the younger of the two liberal ideals. It's probably far less familiar to most people than the ideal of toleration. It's probably intuitively far less plausible and attractive than the ideal of toleration. Nevertheless, I think it has an absolutely central role to play in the correct vision of the ideal liberal polity, and I'm willing to defend the ideal of neutrality as a central part of that vision. So the ideal is this. The arguments and justifications that are made for political principles and for corresponding legislation enacted to realize them must not make reference to, nor depend for their success on the truth of, nor exclusively address those who affirm any particular vision of the good life. So neutrality in this sense requires, for example, that when political justifications and political arguments are being made, for example, it's not permitted to appeal to theistic premises in making your political arguments. Why? Well, because it's perfectly reasonable for people not to believe in a God. Okay? For that reason, a political argument which made appeal to that kind of premise would not reach those people. And it ought to reach those people, given that they are not unreasonable in not believing in a God. And neutrality appeals to far more than just theistic premises. It appeals to the whole range of opinions, values, and beliefs about which reasonable people can disagree. The claim is that political argument in the ideal liberal state must not make reference to any one particular set of values, beliefs, or practices in the making of political justifications. Why? Well, because within limits, people can reasonably disagree about these questions. So the law, in essence, must remain silent on these questions. Toleration. So liberal neutrality responds to the fact of pluralism, the fact of reasonable pluralism, the fact that it can be reasonable for people to disagree on the big questions. For that reason, political argument can't take sides, so to speak, on those big questions. Toleration responds to an entirely different set of social circumstances. And as I said earlier, it's far more well established in the liberal tradition than neutrality. Has a very long and venerable history. So here's how I understand toleration, liberal toleration. So liberal toleration is an individual or political practice of non-interference with what other people do, despite opposition to what they do, for the principled reason that what these other people do violates no one's rights. So in order for a person to be tolerant of, let's say, another person, it has to be the case that she opposes what that other person does, and as a result, she has a disposition to interfere with what it is they're doing that she opposes, but she nevertheless doesn't act on that disposition so as to interfere with what they're doing. Why? Well, on my view of toleration, she exercises that self-restraint because what it is those other people do doesn't violate anybody's rights. So toleration, understood in that way, is an incredibly difficult virtue, at least at the individual level. Indeed, some people have claimed that toleration is paradoxical because of the nature of the opposition to which it's a response. So toleration requires not interfering with the actions of others, despite a fervent belief that these actions are immoral or misguided or degrading or offensive or demeaning or sinful or self-destructive, so long as those actions don't violate anybody else's rights. Okay, so that's very hard to do when you have a genuine belief, for example, that the way somebody else is behaving is thoroughly degrading, okay, or demeaning to them. It's very hard to rein in the disposition that you have to actually stop them doing that for their own good, let's say, when it's the case that they're not violating anybody's rights. So on my account, respect for rights sets the limits of toleration. Okay, so I've laid out the liberal ideal. I've described to you what the ideal of liberal neutrality is, and I've just explained to you how I think of liberal toleration. And we can now start to bring all the pieces together and explain why some liberal theorists are making this claim that neutrality has supplanted and replaced toleration and rendered it redundant. So I was going to speak about Mill, but I won't. So toleration, as I've just said, is a response to a disposition to interfere with somebody else in virtue of opposition to what it is they do. But in the liberal polity, in the ideal liberal polity, in liberalia, that kind of opposition between the political authorities and liberal citizens is absent because the political authorities conform to the principle of neutrality. And the principle of neutrality requires that the political authorities do not stand in opposition to the beliefs, values, practices, etc. of their citizens. It requires that they remain neutral on those questions. Okay? It requires that they do not oppose values, beliefs, etc. of their citizens. So neutrality requires the eradication, the absence of the opposition, to which toleration is a response. So in that sense, it destroys the context for toleration. And that's the reason why some important contemporary theorists of toleration are claiming that if you commit to neutrality as a political ideal, there's no room in your ideal polity for the practice of toleration, because neutrality destroys the context to which toleration is a response. That's the argumentative move that I want to address. So I think that claim has some purchase. The claim that neutrality supplants toleration has some purchase, but it's limited. I think it's true that in liberalia, the political toleration of reasonable people towards whom the authorities are required to be neutral is indeed obsolescent. Because, as I've said, neutrality requires withholding that opposition to which toleration responds. And I think within limits it's quite right and quite correct. And it's required that the ideal liberal state should not have that kind of opposition towards its citizens. However, neutrality, even in the liberal ideal, has limits. In other words, even in liberalia, the political authorities there are not required to be neutral towards all their citizens. they're only required to be neutral towards citizens who exist within the sphere of reasonable pluralism, that is, whose disagreements are reasonable and who accept that it can be reasonable for other people to disagree with them. They're required not to, they're required to exercise neutrality with respect to that group. So this is the green sphere here. Within that sphere, I hope it's coming up as green, within that sphere, the central sphere, that sphere is populated by the majority of people who may have different personal, private beliefs and values, but who nevertheless accept that it's reasonable for other people not to share those values and beliefs, and as a result, they affirm principles of justice as fairness. I think it's true that the state is required, ideally, to be neutral towards that group of people. However, what I'm going to argue is that the milliners and the secularists don't exist within that sphere. They exist within the next circle, toleration. And I think it's with respect to groups such as the milliners and the secularists that toleration has a place even in the ideal state. So even in our political ideal, I think there are groups towards whom toleration is required by the political authorities, and that these groups are different from those who populate the sphere of neutrality in the centre. There's also a further sphere of criminality, and I think that should also be included in our political ideals, actually, but I'm not going to defend that claim tonight. That's too much to attempt. So what I'm going to do is to show why neutrality and toleration, far from being incompatible ideals, and far from it being the case that neutrality just crowds out toleration and fills up all of the political space, so to speak, I'm going to argue that they're complementary and necessary parts of the liberal ideal as a whole. And I think the best way to see this is by examining the question I posed a while back, that is, how should the majority, who exist in the sphere of neutrality, how should they authorise their political agents to treat the milliners and the secularists, who do not, unlike them, accept that disagreement with them can be reasonable? So let's remind ourselves quickly, the milliners want bowler hat wearing to be legally required, and the secularists want to ban it. How should the ideal liberal citizens authorise their political agents to treat the milliners and the secularists? Well, one key issue is whether the milliners or secularists act on their declared political aims by, so to speak, trying to take the law into their own hands. So, for example, perhaps some of the secularists knock the bowler hats off the heads of those they see wearing them, as has just happened here, and the secularist has just exited the scene. Or perhaps cadres of criminal milliners form to hatch evil plots to attack men not wearing bowler hats in public. So perhaps some of these groups act on their beliefs in order to directly, physically interfere with what it is that other people do that contradicts the way they think the world ought to be organised. Now, when the milliners or the secularists act in these ways, they violate the basic rights of the men they target, as defined by justice as fairness. And these rights include the right to physical integrity and the right to freedom of expression, which includes dress. So when the freedom to dress as one sees fit. So when milliners and secularists do these things, when they act in these ways, they perform crimes, and the liberal state, in liberalia, quite rightly acts to prevent them from committing crimes, and it prosecutes and punishes them when they do. So some subsets of the milliners and the secularists are criminals because they attack other people in virtue of the beliefs they have about whether these people are wearing hats or not wearing hats, etc. However, many milliners and secularists, and these are the interesting cases I'm about to outline, I think, for my argument, many milliners and secularists in liberalia have no criminal inclinations and don't take the law into their own hands, so to speak. They abide by the law. I'm going to call these passive milliners and secularists. So passive milliners and secularists don't cause wrongful harm to other people, and they violate no one's rights, but nevertheless, they stand opposed in their beliefs and values to liberalia's political ideals of neutrality and toleration. They don't think it is reasonable for other people to disagree with them, and for that reason, they think that people who disagree with them ought to be addressed by the law. Okay? But the mere fact that they have those beliefs doesn't qualify them as criminal. There are no thought crimes in liberalia. Okay? In order to qualify as criminal, they would have to act on those beliefs to physically attack the groups they oppose. So the passive milliners want this kind of world where everybody is wearing bowler hats, but they're not willing to act in criminal ways to try and achieve this. And of course, the passive secularists want to see this everywhere, but again, not willing to take the law into their own hands. They're law-abiding. So what they want, these groups, is the liberal state to promote their own ends and values, even where this would crowd out opportunities for other people to do the same thing. Now, we don't need to think of these passive groups as necessarily motivated by prejudice or malice. Some of them might be. But I think it's more likely that many of them are paternalists. Okay? So many of them think that it would be better for the people that they oppose to wear hats, to be legally required to wear hats or legally prohibited from wearing hats for reasons connected to those people's well-being. So they think they would be promoting the good of the people they oppose by forcing them either to engage in or to not engage in the practice of wearing bowler hats. So it would be a mistake to think of these people as kind of devilish types who just are informed by prejudice or malice. Many of them don't have these characteristics. Perhaps some of them do, but many of them don't, and that's certainly not my claim about them. What's important to note about the passive milliners and the secularists is that although they pose no imminent threat to public order and security, they're law-abiding, and although they're not criminals, they don't attack other people who engage in the practices they oppose, they nevertheless do actively seek to convert others to their way of thinking. And they would practice oppression if they had the political power to do so. The fact is they don't have the political power to do so. So just imagine this is true of them. Okay. So the passive milliners and the passive secularists, are my vision of this group, commit to justice as fairness, they obey the law for expedient reasons, but they don't commit to it on morally principled grounds, unlike the majority of people, majority of citizens in liberalia, who for morally principled reasons, for reasons drawn from within their own hearts, commit to justice as fairness. The passive milliners and the secularists don't do this. They commit to justice as fairness, which they do for principled reasons, but the principles are principles of expediency. So in other words, they commit to justice as fairness as a modus vivendi, given that they presently lack the political power to do otherwise, okay, to achieve what they want, which is to have a state made in their image. So at best, they accept that justice as fairness is something that the liberal vision of justice is something that they have to put up with, given their present lack of power. So as I've said, their reasons for complying with just laws are principled, but not morally principled. So understood, and this is going to be key to understanding why these groups provide a context for toleration alongside the ideal of neutrality. If we understand the passive milliners and the passive secularists in this way, and by the way, I think there are lots of this is true of many groups in the real world. Understanding them in that way, we can see that they pose a nascent and potential threat to the roots of the liberal state's stability in the support that it's given by its other citizens. So in this ideal world, the stability of the just state is a result of the majority of people, as I've said, affirming principles of justice from within their own hearts. And their allegiance to the liberal state is self-perpetuating and self-replicating, is to be thought of in this way, and it's a product of their lived experience of the benefits of living in a liberal state. Okay, so the more they live and enjoy these benefits, the greater their allegiance becomes. So, for example, they don't give their allegiance to the liberal state because they're scared of what the consequences of not doing so would be for them and their families. That's not why they support the liberal state. What the passive milliners and secularists aim to do within their rights to freedom of speech and expression is to subvert this. Okay? What they aim to do is to agitate, to convert other people to their commitment to oppression. And that agitation stands as a permanent threat to the support given to the liberal state by the majority, upon which it depends for its stability. So the milliners and the secularists are engaging in activities and agitating to convert others to their point of view and as a result to reject the liberal state. They're engaging in activities which I want to claim it's perfectly legitimate and proper for the liberal state to oppose. The liberal state ought not to have opposition to citizens who lie within the limits of reasonable pluralism. It ought to be neutral towards those citizens. But the passive milliners and secularists aren't like that. The passive milliners and secularists are actively agitating to convert others to their point of view in a way that could destroy the stability of the state. And the state in liberalia is not required to be neutral towards them in virtue of that feature they have. The values of the passive milliners and the passive secularists, that is their commitment to making law speak to this practice of bowler hat wearing, that directly opposes the values upon which liberalia is founded. And as I've been saying, it could undermine the present support that liberalia has amongst reasonable citizens. Liberalia affirms the ideal of neutrality, which is opposed by the passive milliners and secularists, and it's quite proper for the state and liberalia to use the law to protect these ideals. So it might do so through education, for example. However, what it won't do, and what it's not legitimate for the state in liberalia to do, and this is the final step in understanding why the state ought to be tolerant of passive milliners and secularists, what the liberal state won't do is oppress the passive milliners and secularists, despite the fact that it has the power to do so, and despite the fact that this is exactly what the passive milliners and the secularists aim to do to others, and so are in no position to complain themselves if that's what's done to them. That's not a sufficient justification for withdrawing from the milliners and the secularists the rights to freedom of expression and speech and association and movement, etc., which create this permanent threat to the roots of stability, the roots of liberalia's stability. So let me try and pull all of this together. So two of the basic rights that all people in liberalia have are to freedom of expression and to freedom of association. And in liberalia, these freedoms are extended to the passive milliners and the secularists, despite the fact that this creates the risk that the conditions necessary for stability will be undermined. So the restraint of the political authorities in liberalia, remember the description of toleration, the structure of toleration given earlier on. So the restraint of the political authorities in liberalia is justified on principal grounds by reference to the importance of upholding the conditions of individual sovereignty for each person, for example, through upholding a principle of equal liberty. I think the fact that in this ideal place, liberalia, the fact that freedoms such as freedom of speech and association are extended to intolerant citizens such as the passive milliners and the passive secularists shows that there is still scope for such states to practice toleration with respect to some of their citizens. And I've just chosen the passive milliners and passive secularists as examples of these groups, but you could fill in the details there in many different ways. So my claim is that the liberal state is properly opposed to the passive milliners and the passive secularists, and yet it ought not to act on that opposition it has towards them, despite the fact that it has the power to do so. It is the state, after all, on the grounds that what the passive milliners and the passive secularists do violates nobody's rights. They exercise their rights to freedom of speech and expression, and the exercise of those rights violates nobody else's rights. And so for those reasons, I think describing the relationship between the liberal state and liberalia and the passive secularists and the passive milliners shows that the structure of that relationship does indeed provide a context for toleration, which sits alongside the context for neutrality. So neutrality is appropriate with respect to one group of citizens, and toleration remains appropriate even in our political ideal with respect to a different group of citizens with quite different characteristics. So that's my argument. I want to just finish by making a few comments about the nature of political ideals and thinking in terms of political ideals, because I think that's really the subtext of a lot of what I've been saying tonight. So one response somebody might make to what I've been claiming is to say, well, look, the ideal liberal state, liberalia, ought not to include passive milliners and secularists. Okay, you're making a mistake if you include such people in your political ideals. And they might make the same move with respect to saying that criminals ought not to be included in our political in our visions of the ideal polity, the ideal society. I think that's wrong as well. But with respect to milliners and secularists, somebody might say, well, because of these features that they have, that is, they don't accept that it can be reasonable for people not to share the views they have, we ought to exclude them from our political ideal. And the claim that's being made in the literature is just that neutrality replaces toleration only in ideal circumstances. And I think that's a really big mistake to make that move. It's certainly not true to the work of John Rawls, from whom much of this is derived. But I think if you start to do that, once you start to purge your political ideals of people like the milliners and the secularists, then they start to lose interest for us as real, flawed people. I think that the point of laying out a blueprint for an ideal society, any ideal society, not just the liberal ideal, is interesting only insofar as it's useful. That is, it's interesting only insofar as it can help us to construct a theory of what some people are coming to call transitional justice. That is, how you get from here to closer to that ideal. Of course, you never will get to that ideal, and that isn't the point of political ideals. Rather, the point of political ideals is, as Rawls puts it, to guide the course of social reform. That is, to move us from where we are to closer to that ideal. And I think if you start to theorize away in your ideal, so to speak, thinking, ideal political thinking, you start to theorize away people like the passive milliners and the secularists, then your political ideal becomes impotent in that respect. It ceases to have the power to guide the course of social reform. I want to finish with a quote from Rawls, which I think is connected with this point. So here's what he says. The liberties of the intolerant may persuade them to a belief in freedom, provided that an intolerant sect is not so strong initially that it can impose its will straight away, or does not grow so rapidly that the psychological principle has no time to take hold, it will tend to lose its intolerance and accept liberty of conscience, says Rawls. So Rawls thinks, or perhaps better, Rawls hopes, that those who start off, like the passive milliners and the secularists, those who start off by affirming their principles or affirming commitment to principles of justice as a modus vivendi, that is, for reasons of expediency, those who start off in that way will be transformed into fully reasonable citizens, to use his terminology, by the experience of freedom themselves, by the experience of living in a society in which freedoms of expression, association, movement, etc., are extended to them. Now, unless liberal toleration is practiced with respect to people like the passive milliners and secularists, then that hope is dashed, in Rawls's terms. But unless we include such people in the liberal ideal polity, we lose the principled arguments that we have for tolerating them, arguments that are consistent with and are indeed derived from the liberal ideal as a whole. So, in other words, if we conceive of liberalia as an expression, as a description of that liberal ideal, as exhaustively populated by people who unanimously agree on principles of justice, liberal justice, for moral reasons. That is, if we conceive of liberalia as a place in which neutrality fills up all the space of politics and there is no room left for the practice of political toleration, then ideals such as those described by liberalia are nothing but a pretty fantasy, and thinking about them is only to daydream. Thank you.
Seems to be a very imaginative state, the liberal state you're discussing about, because any state has certain boundaries, certain limits. Any state with an ideology will promote its ideas over other ideas, will protect its ideas, and will force, not force its ideas, will push its ideas across to other people. So in terms of, so there must be certain limits. As an example, you talked about freedom. Would this liberal state accept, like was published quite recently, a dummy's guide to paedophilia? Freedom of expression. I mean, this is a question to be asked. Is there any limitations there? And like with the others within the society there, they have their ideas and they have certain limitations to their ideas. I mean, look at France as an example. They're subjugating Muslim women in order to sort of protect the Western secular liberal values there. So any state you look at in reality has certain limits and will push these ideas, you know, as opposed to other ideas. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what you said about what's going on in France. I think that's a violation of toleration and neutrality, and certainly the direction in which France is moving is very, very far from any liberal ideal as it's expressed in the philosophical literature, which is my area. And of course, it's true that there's no state in the world that even gets close to conforming to liberalia. Okay, but I think there are some states that are further away from it than others, and I think that France's recent, more extensive ban really takes it far further from that liberal ideal rather than closer to it. And with respect to your first point about freedom of expression, I think you gave a really good and difficult example. I think some of the hardest questions of toleration come up with respect to freedom of expression, and in particular with respect to what counts as advocacy, and with respect to whether offence caused to others by your act of expression can be understood as a violation of their rights. And I think the kind of glib liberal answer, which I don't think any philosophical liberal actually gives, but the glib answer is just to say, well, you know, offence is your problem, and I'm going to, if my exercise of my freedom of speech and expression causes you offence, well, you need to grow a thicker skin. I don't think that's a good answer, and I think there are far more nuanced ways you can attempt to justify placing some limits on acts of freedom of expression, which are nevertheless recognisably liberal limits that conform to this liberal ideal. But it's very, very difficult to do that, and you have to do quite a lot of philosophical work to justify it.
Thank you very much indeed for your excellent lecture, insightful really. My question is starting with a scholar. One scholar's idea saying neutrality is an empty ideal incapable of supporting a liberal community. I want to know from you whether mass media nowadays, because we are all having mass media impact or effect of the mass media to our houses, does it support neutrality at the expense, quote unquote, neutrality at the expense of tolerance? This is one question. The other question is, do you think the majority are custodian of moral authority, and the state use that to impose its own precepts on the society?
With respect to the first question about the mass media,
is the media helping the neutrals at the expense of people who look for tolerance?
I doubt it. I wouldn't. I don't have huge amounts of faith in the mass media with respect to any political ideals.
Because the discussions are coming in the mass media between groups. So
Sorry, I can't hear you.
discussions in the media are very fervent between different opposing groups in society, and so one group of people try to advance their ideas, the other try to suppress them, and then you need tolerance in the sense that so that a person could really understand the other points of view, and will the media play a positive role in this respect, or it is a hindrance to?
Okay, I see. So insofar as it provides a kind of forum for people who might otherwise be opposed to engage in dialogue and conversation with one another, that might actually promote the ideal of toleration. I think that can happen. Yeah, for sure. I think much depends on. I think a lot depends on the nature of the representatives that are chosen for each particular point of view in a given debate, and I do think that certainly news programming should take more care in that respect to be presenting the best possible side, I think, of an argument rather than the worst possible side of an argument. But it's certainly a possibility. Yeah. Whether it happens all that often, I have some skepticism about. And your second question?
Second question is about the majority. You talk about them as the mainstream. Can we look at it as a custodian of moral authority? So the state can use it to its own advantage at the expense of an average person?
Sorry, do you mean in the ideal state, or do you mean in
the practice? I mean, when you look at the society, does it really? When you think the moral authority is so important as well, so do you think really the majority represent that moral authority, that religious basic authority, or not?
I wouldn't. I would share John Stuart Mill's skepticism about what he called the tyranny of the majority, which is he took to be a negative feature of democratic political systems. And of course, he advocated his own principle of toleration, the liberty principle, as a way to counter that danger, that majority views and majority customs and practices could come to serve as grounds for the oppression and the smothering of those who don't conform to those practices. So, no, I wouldn't. I wouldn't have. I would share Mill's doubts and worries about the tyranny of the majority. Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. First, I would like to ask about the event in France with the ban of the veiling of the women's face.
Yeah.
Do you think that there would later on be a ban on other clothing items such as the turban or other forms of clothing that people find are imperative?
Yeah.
And also with the event in the US with Pastor John trying to burn the Holy Quran, do you believe that the government played an important role in trying to eliminate the threat that he caused? And do you believe that he was one of the criminal secularists? And what do you believe should be done to deal with people like that?
Okay. I mean, with respect to the first question, the ban in France, I mean, this second, more extensive ban, which is a ban on the burqa in public places, and I think this came into effect yesterday, actually. Yeah, very, very recently, and Muslim women in France have been coming out, or some Muslim women in France have been coming out in protest. I mean, this succeeds an earlier ban, of course, in 2004, which related to, if you like, kind of public civic spaces, so schools and universities and courts, etc., which was a ban on what the wording of the ban is, ostensible religious symbols. Okay, so it's a ban. It was a ban on the Muslim headscarf, also the turban, Jewish skull caps. And prominent Christian crosses, although interestingly the ban does not apply to Christian crosses that aren't ostensible, and I think that tells us quite a lot about what's wrong with the ban. And what this what this further move does is kind of extend this. My understanding is that at the moment it only applies to the burqa. Who knows? I mean, the French are justifying this by reference to their ideal of secularism, laïcité, which has some. I mean, there are ways of articulating that ideal that are philosophically respectable. I think the French have got it completely wrong, actually, in the way that they're interpreting their own political ideals. I hope it doesn't. I mean, I wish the ban had never been passed, and I hope it doesn't extend. For consistency's sake, they had better extend it to all religious symbols. Otherwise, it's just a clear example of prejudice, it seems to me. But as to what will happen, I don't know. I'm very surprised at this further ban, actually. I think it's a worrying development in French. In European politics as well, because it's happening in different places in Europe too. The second point you raised, I'm not familiar with that. I know about the pastor who burnt the Quran, but I'm not familiar with what happened to him or the details of that particular event. And perhaps you can fill me in.
He was somewhat pressured not to burn the Quran, and he didn't do it in the end. I think that's what happened.
Right.
But he just kind of went away.
Okay.
And after that, he didn't show up. But for quite a while, he was trying really hard to speak up against Islam. CNN reporters were quite often, going against him, saying that what he was doing was absolutely prejudice and against Christian morals as well. That's basically what happened. And Obama, he briefly commented on the happenings, but did not do much on the matter.
Yeah. I mean, look. I think I think that what he did was deeply offensive. In the same way, I think that back in the UK, I don't know, maybe you are. I'm sure lots of you are way too young to remember, but the burning of Salman Rushdie's book, The Satanic Verses, in some northern towns in the UK. I think that was that was offensive as well. I find book burning offensive, whatever the book. As to whether, I think your question then was, well, should we tolerate that kind of act of expression? Should he be permitted to do that? Was that the question?
That, and also what should be done to people who are not tolerant? How can neutrality and tolerance come together?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think this was in part of what I was talking about was to argue that, well, a lot is going to turn on whether the acts that intolerant people perform are criminal acts, okay? And what I mean by that is whether they violate the basic rights that other people have, according to the law derived from a just set of principles, or whether they threaten public order and safety. And the book burning, in itself, and insofar as it just causes offence, I don't think violates anybody else's rights, but there may be a case for saying that ought not to be permitted for public order considerations, okay, given the context in which it's undertaken, given the vicinity in which it's undertaken, given the people who live in that neighbourhood. All of these things would be relevant to thinking about whether you can prevent that kind of activity on the grounds of public order considerations. I do think it's a grossly offensive act. I don't think offence prima facie is sufficient for something to be banned or not permitted. Or at least I think you have to say a lot more about the harm that offence causes to get to that conclusion. That's my view.
I have a question on your model, whether the model is not missing one component, which would be the guardian.
The guardian.
The guardian.
Yeah.
The guardian. At the beginning of your talk, you spoke about the great majority of the citizens of Liberalia to be committed to all of these principles. Yet the model does not have the process in order to reaffirm them in a governance sense. So as a personal example, I lived in a country that was very close to Liberalia. but the citizenry was sort of divided in three groups. And in one election, the milliners won. And they proceeded to use the power of the state in order to suppress the secularists and to neutralize the liberal majority. The country needed a guardian to step in order to reaffirm the liberal principles, which eventually happened. But without the guardian, the whole system would have been turned over. Now, my question again is, what is the component of your model which provides for the guardians?
Okay, that's a hard question. I mean, I guess your example illustrates a situation in which this hope that Rawls expresses turns out to be false, okay? Because perhaps, your intolerant sect very quickly, before, it's had time to enjoy the benefits of freedom, very quickly gets its hands on some of the reins of power and then starts to actually dismantle the just state. And I mean, this happens in a sort of has happened in a sort of local context back in the UK, where racist political parties have won various sort of local elections and have got their hands on power in local councils. I mean, as to what Rawls would say about this, well, I don't think he has much to say about this, and that's one of the key grounds on which many people criticize him, okay, that he doesn't, and this kind of liberal thinking in general doesn't actually provide you with solutions when things start to go wrong, when the world starts to very badly stop conforming to the ideals that you lay out. I mean, you're right, I think, that you need some kind of, I don't know whether I would call it a guardian, you need some kind of political authorities which are fit to uphold the values that you, that this dangerous intolerant sect is proposing to overthrow. I mean, in part, a constitution is supposed to do that, and they're very difficult to dismantle. Okay, so that's one sort of set of safeguards that you do have institutionally. I mean, unless, I suppose the threat then would be that you actually get a group who just propose to completely revolt and overthrow the whole system, constitution and all. And what do you do in that set of circumstances? That's difficult, I think. I think if you're very sure that the kind of principles that are being overturned are the right ones, and if you're very sure that your arguments are sound and good, then you have some justification there for resisting that kind of revolt. As to the form that resistance should take, etc., I couldn't. I'm not an expert in these matters, but I think there is some warrant from within this very abstract ideal for taking those steps. But the warrant is very philosophical. It's going to be related to making the right sorts of arguments and being very sure that the principles you propose to uphold by force, if necessary, have very, very secure philosophical foundations. I'm not sure that in the real world that's ever the case.
I have a question about something that came up early in your talk when you were describing why citizens who are perhaps non-liberal in their private lives might nonetheless adopt a liberal political outlook that might come from their sort of genuine moral principles. And the way you described it was the sort of premise, and it may just turn out that this is an incomplete description, which is why I think I found it unsatisfying, but the way you described it was the sort of premise of this maneuver, of this move, was their recognition that if you let reason run its course in a relatively free arena, then you're going to get lots of disagreement. You're going to get pluralism.
Yeah.
And the conclusion seemed to be, or an intermediate conclusion before you got to the conclusion of liberalism at the political level, was that the disagreement that results then is reasonable. And that step seemed questionable to me. It seemed that on one hand, one could acknowledge that reason described in a certain way, when it's left to run its own course, will lead to a lot of pluralism, but that's because reason is very fallible and people are only imperfectly rational. And so sure, there is going to be lots of pluralism, but I'm not sure why recognizing that reason will behave this way requires one to adopt the view that the disagreement or the pluralism that results is reasonable or rational.
I mean, that is a different way of going about explaining the commitment to reasonable pluralism. And David Estlund makes that argument. He thinks that, well, look, you know, rather than saying pluralism is the inevitable outcome of human reason operating freely, we might say pluralism is the inevitable outcome of human reason because human reason will often operate in a faulty way. Okay, and people make mistakes and people get things wrong. Of course, the danger with that is there's a danger there that you don't get liberalism out of that, okay?
I mean, that was in a way what my worry was, that, yeah, you don't get the conclusion that the disagreement is reasonable, and so the motivation for something like the neutrality principle looks to have dropped away.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think that's in part why I reject that kind of argumentative move. I mean, there was a lot. I have not given much detail on that argument, which comes from Rawls, the view that I have, which is from Rawls, that pluralism is the outcome of human reason operating freely. I mean, that kind of sounds really grand and sort of, you know, almost metaphysical, but it's not in Rawls at all. It's really prosaic. I mean, he makes some comments and reflections on, you know, the fact, for example, one of them is, well, the concepts that we use in making judgments and in having arguments with one another are necessarily vague, okay? And so they require interpretation, and people will interpret them in different ways, consistent with each of them using their reason correctly, okay? Or he says, you know, the way in which we come to judge these big questions, so whether there's a God and the best life to live and how we ought to live with others and all of these questions, is necessarily going to be affected by our own particular histories, that is, by our own particular biographies and the experiences that we've had. These things, as human beings, okay, we're not, you know, Kantian noumenal selves. As situated human beings, these things are going to affect how we exercise our judgment. And given that we all have different backgrounds and different biographies, and we're all starting from different places, and we're all on different journeys, inevitably, if we're not coerced and oppressed, we will come to exercise our judgment in ways that deliver different conclusions. So I think he takes himself to be offering a quite uncontroversial and quite minimal account of the operation of human reason in conditions of freedom. Whereas I think that the account that you kind of put on the table, you have to do an awful lot more to unpack that account and to cash it out. So you have to give an account of the proper operation of human reason. I mean, there you go. There's a, you know, and maybe then that will get you liberalism, but maybe it won't. Okay, and I think Rawls is far more minimal. A modest account is more plausible for that reason.
Political socialization plays a significant role in any political system, including whether democratic or not. Political socialization. So if we go beyond the idea of tolerance into mutual respect.
Sorry, could you repeat that? If you go beyond the idea of
tolerance to mutual respect, that is to say, we politically socialize people into accepting diversity. I understand now in Europe, the idea of cultural tolerance and cultural diversity is under attack.
Yes,
but do you think this will be one way out of the problem? not to promote only tolerance, but mutual respect, that people will appreciate their differences.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, actually. I think toleration is your starting point, okay? It's your basis upon which further values are then to be constructed and built. Because if you don't have toleration, you have conflict and you have war. You know, you have a Hobbesian state of a war of all against all. Toleration is your starting point, but it's certainly not the whole of justice, and it certainly shouldn't be, and I don't think any advocate of toleration sees it in that way. They all go on to articulate a more, if you like, positive, detailed and constructive vision of the relationships that should exist between people in just societies. And you mentioned the ideal of mutual respect. And I think this is, you know, there's kind of a big literature on the idea of mutual respect, which, if you like, could be seen as the next step beyond toleration for many liberal theorists. I mean, incidentally, there are some prominent people in the literature. Elisabetta Galliotti, an Italian political theorist, wrote a book on toleration, who thinks that actually toleration and mutual respect are the same thing. She thinks that what it is to be tolerant of another person is to have respect for them in all their difference, in all the ways they differ from you. And that's not the vision I have. I think toleration responds to far nastier things, far nastier ways in which people relate to one another. And ideally, you know, you want to get toleration as your basis, and then you want to move beyond it. Yeah. But I think what you say about cultural diversity coming under attack is quite right. I think that's happening in the UK with some of the things that the Prime Minister has been saying about multiculturalism recently. And the danger is that you're actually moving back, let alone mutual respect, you're withdrawing from toleration as well. I think that's very, very worrying, especially what's going on in Europe. I think it's a worry.
Theories will remain as theories or fanciful philosophies unless you see it in reality, being practiced in reality. Everybody seeks justice, rights and fairness, but the model you gave in Liberalia, you said that the laws are derived from a just set of principles.
Yeah.
Why is it that these, you know, there's principles upon which it's the principles in question? Why do you avoid why do you avoid the basic questions in life? For example, where have you come from? Where are you going to? What's your purpose in life? Why is it that? I mean, these are fundamental questions that everybody asks once in their life.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because justice, fairness, or whatever, that's universal, not just to humans, to animals, to the environment, to the universe. So what gives a person a right, or for example, a woman, to say what is right for a man, or a man what is right for a woman, or an animal, or the environment?
Yeah.
We are creating these, inverted commas, just set of principles. All right, thank you.
Thank you. But I think that's precisely what these principles are supposed to do. And it's precisely because these questions are so important to each of us as individuals that, according to this vision of justice, it's not up to the state to tell us or say anything about how those questions ought to be answered. It devolves that back down to the individual level, to the individual exercising their own judgment to find their own answers to these questions. And it's supposed to provide a political, form of political and social cooperation which enables each person to do this for themselves. Okay, that's the point of the way in which those freedoms at its heart are justified. So it's precisely not an attempt to impose, in a kind of top-down manner, a particular vision of what constitutes a good life or a particular vision of the right form of religious practice. neutrality is all about not making those judgments and leaving those questions up to individuals who will exercise their reason and judgment in different ways to find their own answers. So I hope I haven't given the impression that the liberalism I've been discussing today has that kind of, you know, sort of almost authoritarian character of taking a certain moral philosophy or set of values and stamping them on groups of people attempting to organize themselves socially and politically. It's supposed to be the kind of opposite to that, precisely because these questions are so important to each of us.
Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
Some of the things you've just espoused sound quite familiar, sound very familiar in terms of what an educationalist called John Dewey was talking about. How people are shaped by their experiences and their interactions with their environment. And there are many other people who have this almost dynamic view of ethics and views of tolerance, that it's a dynamic process.
Yeah.
Interestingly, though, there is another group who say, yes, it's good to have that as well, but you need to also have a moral compass, a moral framework to base your ideas and your judgments on, for example. So if we were to talk about, for example, medical ethics, and if we were to talk about particularly, there was a situation in the Hillsborough disaster where there was a chap called Tony Bland in the UK who was fed by a nasogastric tube. And in those days, for example, they didn't know that those people in a permanent vegetative state could actually recover. And so his case was taken to the court by the health authority, and they said, well, you know, he's in a permanent vegetative state, which in a sense that term devalues that human being anyway.
Yeah.
So, and they said, well, we'll remove the tube, we'll remove the mechanical device. And so the person died. Now, that's the outcome of a society where they've made decisions amongst themselves. They've introduced a panel of experts.
Yeah.
But there is an argument that, for example, if you're in the UAE, there would be a moral framework which says you can't discontinue medical treatment, one thing. You can't allow suffering if you withheld any form of treatment. And then there's another view that this gentleman has rights himself and that maybe the court should have appointed a representative to support that person. So, in effect, yes, it's very important to get the contemporary views of everybody around, because obviously we live in the times that are changing. There will be challenges for us to, and new issues to address. But at the same time, you need a moral framework or some sort of framework, moral compass, to direct you and to base your opinions on. And that's one of the, I'm not pro or against Obama, but that's one of the issues that his critics have, is we don't know what he stands for, so we don't have anything to really debate.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. There's lots there in what you said. I mean, I think in the UK, the British Medical Council does have a code of ethics, I think. So it's not sort of entirely, it's not a body of experts who just sort of do what they want. They are bound by a code of ethics. It may not be the right one. I mean, in the case you described, I think, I'm not sure whether the problem there is an ethical problem or whether it's just the fact that with hindsight we can see that the judgments that the experts made at that time did not in fact reflect the reality, which is that this man could have recovered. And with the development of medical science, perhaps we come to see that decisions we made in the past where science was less developed weren't the right ones. So I think there's an element of that in what you said. And I think generally the role of experts in sort of liberal democratic politics is really interesting and is really difficult for liberals of the kind of the sort of Rawlsian persuasion. Okay, what kind of interaction should there be between the members of the majority who affirm these principles of justice as fairness and groups of experts upon whom we have to rely to make detailed in making detailed kind of policy decisions. I mean, to what extent should they be bound by values that the majority affirm to be the right ones? Or if we do try and bind them in that way, do we risk, because we ourselves are not experts, do we risk clipping their wings in terms of making decisions that could have great future benefits for all of us? Yeah. So I mean, I think you're right that those kinds of decisions that are made by experts have to be guided by values. I think the question then is, which values and whose values, and how do we know we've got the right values? I think there are things that you can say about this actually from within the perspective of liberalism, and I've written some stuff on this myself with respect to climate change scientists and how they ought to interact with policymakers who affirm the kinds of ideals that I've been outlining tonight, and what kinds of restrictions is legitimate to impose on them in their capacity as advisors. So I think, yeah, it's an interesting area.
Hello, thank you very much. Just one more theoretical question, actually. Are there any really neutral states? You were saying that toleration was sometimes considered as a paradoxical idea. Isn't neutrality also considered? I mean, can't be neutrality also be considered as a completely paradoxical idea? Are there any? I mean, who is claiming that there are really neutral states? You were talking about the French situation, which I think exemplifies the paradox. The French claim they're neutral, but they aren't. They aren't because basically it's a Christian majority or a Christian secularized majority, which comes from a religion that doesn't have a lot of or almost none ostensive religious signs, that basically makes a law against those two religions, the Jews and the Muslims, who have ostensive signs. So isn't the French argument basically a lie to say that we are a neutral state, although they are actually having a religious point of view, which is the fact that the French majority in the French secular system comes basically from a specific religion, which is the Christian religion, which doesn't have, or at least in its recent developments since a few centuries, any ostensible religious signs. So, I mean, I'm not very knowledgeable about political philosophy, but who would the political philosopher be who really thinks neutrality is a perfectly coherent idea?
Well, I think the fact that the French say that they use the word neutrality doesn't mean that they are actually acting for reasons of neutrality, or that they conform in any way to neutrality as I understand it, and as Rawls understands it, they don't. I think there are a number of justifications for that the French state gives for the ban. Some of them appeal to an interpretation of laïcité, which is central to their political tradition. Some of them interpret that in terms of neutrality, but most of them don't. I mean, most of them interpret laïcité in terms of citizenship and in terms of active citizenship. And the claim is that what it is for everybody to be to have conditions of equal citizenship. What's required is that no threats to the allegiance to the state should be permitted in the public sphere, and they then claim that religious symbols constitute such a threat. So that kind of argument, in its best form, and I don't think any politician actually makes this argument, but some philosophers have at least articulated this argument, that you can trace that back to Rousseau, right? Rousseau had this great kind of fear of sects and groups which would threaten universal citizenship. And I just think that's, I think it's, I agree with everything you said about the ideal of secularism. I think how it's being interpreted. I mean, if they were to really be true, to the best philosophical interpretation of secularism, to some sort of Rousseauian vision of secularism. Then they would reconfigure their calendars such that Christian holidays weren't public holidays. They would extend their bans perhaps beyond religious symbols to evidence of membership of any particular partisan group, right? So particular, I don't know, environmental groups or particular kinds of pressure groups, these sorts of, and forms of dress and expression that are associated with those. To be consistent with the best vision of secularism, they would have to keep doing that until you end up with a kind of citizenry who are all sort of faceless, robots, and I think then the ideal just starts to look absurd. But of course, that's not what they do. They implement what they call secularism in a quite prejudiced way. And they're certainly not willing to reconfigure, for example, the working week or all their public holidays in order to purge Christianity from those aspects of their society. And I think that in itself speaks volumes. But do I think there's any society or state that conforms to the principle of neutrality? No, I don't know. There probably never will be.